T-minus 32 minutes and counting here at the Kennedy Space Center for the launch of Apollo 9 and its 10-day Earth orbital mission, a highly critical one to make the schedule of landing man on the moon this year. We've been talking about how critical the lunar module is to the success of Apollo 9 and to the success of the entire Apollo program. The LEM's been in development for over 6 years now, since NASA first accepted the concept of a vehicle which would ferry astronauts between the Apollo mothership and the moon. NASA made that decision a year after work had begun on the command module, and like the command module, the LEM has had its share of growing pains, and David Shoemaker tells us about them.
Strange. It doesn't have to fly in the air, so it's not aerodynamic. And it's sort of grotesque. It looks a lot like a spider sitting there on its legs. But I think for the job that it's designed to do, it can do it.
Jim McDivitt was not always so confident. He and his fellow astronauts have watched with understandable concern as engineers tinkered with the LEM over the years, making changes to improve it and changing the improvements. Tracing the LEM from its first concept through to its present incarnation gives some idea of how radical those changes have been. Part of the problem was they had to start to work before they really knew what they needed to land on the moon. Weight has been a crucial problem all along. 1/10 of a pound saved was cause for cheers. Metal was shaved wherever possible, and in some cases shaved too closely. A fuel tank pared down to save weight finally burst and had to be redesigned again. The first LEM got all the way to the launch site only to be shipped back to the factory because of fuel line leaks. And just last month, 9 fittings on the latest LEM were replaced because of a kind of metal fatigue. The Apollo fire caused the same kind of retesting and rethinking of the LEM as it did of the main spacecraft. The interior was rechecked and then more delay as flammable material was removed, wiring redone, and fire extinguishers installed. The astronauts, too, added to the wait and the delay by insisting they wanted radar on board so they could monitor the rendezvous. The engineers got even by taking away their couches and forcing them to stand, but the astronauts didn't really mind because the trip is short after all, and besides, now they can get closer to see out the rendezvous window placed awkwardly over their heads. But the most serious problem has been with the engines. The ascent engine, in its ground checkout, developed trouble something like a knock in your car's engine. The repair bill was slightly more, though, $5 million. The descent engine has had its problems, too. It also ran rough, and then 2 of them blew up during ground tests. Finally, months behind schedule, everything was put together, and the first and only LEM to fly so far lifted off its launch pad at Cape Kennedy. There were no men aboard this one. Neither engine worked as planned, but NASA decided the engines were not at fault, blamed electronics, and called the test a success. Still, a year later, a manned LEM was not ready, and so Apollo 8 carried thousands of pounds of water and not a LEM to the moon. Seemed only fitting somehow that if there was to be a LEM simulator to teach astronauts how to fly the LEM, it should have trouble too, and it did. Or rather, they did. 2 of them crashed. No one was hurt, but officials decided that training was more dangerous than the mission and grounded the trainer. Despite its hard luck history, George Skurla, the man responsible for assembling the LEM at Cape Kennedy, is still confident.
We've had our problems, but I think they're all developmental problems, and the spacecraft is a very sophisticated spacecraft. And we had problems with LEM 1 that we solved, and the vehicle was launched and flew successfully. And we had some problems with LEM 3, and we've solved those, and we fully expect that that vehicle will fly and fly well.
And one of the 2 men who is betting his life at will also has reviewed the problems.
Now, when we started out, we, meaning the Grumman Company and NASA, to learn how to build a spacecraft like this, there were a lot of problems. We had super lightweight wiring and super lightweight everything. And there were some things that were just too super lightweight. And we made those a little heavier. But we went through the development, and we were assigned to LEM 2, saw it go through its growing pains, and we got LEM 3, and it's saw its growing pains. But we've reached a point now where I have great confidence in the spacecraft. It's nothing wrong with it. It showed itself in tests to be very reliable.
Despite the public confidence of the men who build and will fly the LEM, there will be a collective sigh of relief when this mission is over. For all the publicity of the hazards of Apollo 8's flight to the moon, it is this flight of Apollo 9 that has concerned insiders most. and will really determine whether we'll be successful in our commitment to land a man on the moon before the end of the year. David Shoemaker, CBS News, Kennedy Space Center, Florida.
What's going to happen today, beyond the liftoff itself, once this spacecraft is in orbit, is this. This is what actually goes into orbit. The S4B, the third stage of the Saturn V rocket. Once it is in orbit, on its second revolution over Australia, this spacecraft and its service module, which actually form the spacecraft, separate from the S4B third stage. Then 4 panels do not come off like this. They blow off in space, exposing the lunar excursion module, or the lunar module it's called now. The excursion was dropped for fear it might sound like a picnic in the park or something, but the lunar module is exposed there. Then the command module is turned around and comes back and docks with the lunar module. And then later, springs eject the lunar module and push the entire spaceship and its lunar module away from the S4B, which is then fired to go into solar orbit. Then this is the equipment with which these men will be working, experimenting on the rest of the first 5 days of this flight. We can now go out to Downey, California, where at North American Rockwell they build the spacecraft, and where Bill Stout and Leo Krupp, our Downey astronaut, can show us just what has to take place for that delicate maneuver of docking today. Bill?
Walter, you see on the nose of the spacecraft the docking ring and the probe you were talking about a few minutes ago. And here at the home of Apollo, with Leo Krupp, who is the chief Apollo research pilot for North American Rockwell, it seems the question is, what does this mission mean in terms of the spacecraft, Leo? What are we asking it to do that it hasn't been asked to do before?
Well, Bill, for the first time, we're going to actually dock with the lunar module in space. So this will be the first test of our docking system. Also, after docking with the LEM while it's in the S4B, we will eject it for the first time, checking out the spring ejector system. Following that, we're going to do several surface propulsion burns with the lunar module attached to the nose of the command service module.
And we've never done that before.
That's right. That'll be the first time for this. We've done it in the simulator many times, but this will be the first flight test. After that will be Rusty's spacewalk, of course, to prove that we can go from one vehicle to the other via the outside route. And following that, the LEM systems check out, and the high point of the entire mission, of course, which is the separation of the lunar module in a manned configuration for the first time, where they'll fly out about 100 miles, come back in and do a LEM active rendezvous and a LEM active docking with the command service module.
How complicated is this docking, Leo?
Well, the docking really isn't too complicated. It's a lot like in-flight refueling in airplanes. On the nose of the spacecraft, we have the drogue, which is extended about 10 inches, and the pilot flies in using a target on the lunar module and a sight in his window to mate the probe and the drogue. There are 3 capture latches in the head of the probe which engage the drogue and hold the 2 vehicle in what we call the soft docking configuration. The probe and drogue are mated. However, the 2 vehicles are still about 10 inches apart. As soon as Dave Scott has his attitude all aligned, he will then throw a switch in the cockpit which energizes a nitrogen bottle and retracts the probe and pulls the 2 docking rings smartly together. This releases 12 docking latches, and the 2 vehicles are then firmly mated in a hard docking configuration.
And those 12 latches, Walter, Leo assures me, are a good bet to go all at once. I asked him whether 11 out of 12 would be a reasonable guess. He said no, 12 for sure. Certainly we're counting on it.
I believe it is true that if they don't catch, the pilots can throw them manually, can't they, Leo?
That's right, Walter. We have an indicator in the cockpit which will tell us if we have 6 of them mated or not. And regardless of what the indicator tells us, Dave Scott will remove the tunnel, go up into the tunnel area, and visually check each one of the latches. And if they're not mated automatically, he can mate them in a manual configuration.
At that altitude and that speed, they certainly better have a good catch to make sure everything goes.
What's the maximum speed tolerable there, Leo, for that docking?
Well, the limits, Walter, are from 0.1 to 1 foot per second at contact. However, in this particular docking that we're going to be doing today, the S4B will be 150,000 pounds heavier than normal since it has not done the translunar injection burn. So I'm sure Dave is going to go in very cautiously, and he'll probably dock at about 0.25 feet per second in order to keep the structural loads down, since both vehicles will be heavier than normal.
That's about equivalent of 18 hundredths of a mile per hour, I think.
That's pretty slow, but and once he gets contact, then he'll go ahead and thrust with his reaction control systems to push the probe into the drogue to make sure it doesn't bounce out.
That's
and
so
he can
slow.
hit within a foot of this funnel, and he'll go down into the hole and engage the capture latches.
That's so slow that I doubt that Bill Stout could hold his balance walking that slowly.
Well, we have Bill strapped in the seat this morning so he can't fall out.
Well, it's good to have you back with us, Leo, on the flight of Apollo 9. The weather is certainly not very good down here, but the count is going on, and there is not supposed to be any weather constraint to the flight. It's T-minus 21 minutes and counting. In our CBS News weather headquarters, weather consultant Gordon Barnes there in New York can perhaps tell us even more about the weather than we can tell out our window here. Gordon?
Waller, in the immediate Cape Kennedy area, the clouds are going to remain with you throughout the entire launch. There's also a light, small area of light rain and light rain showers just to the east of you over the Atlantic Ocean. There's a good chance that some of those will move in over you between 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock. But the recovery aboard area New Bermuda is really having some rough weather. A major storm that has dumped some 4 to 25 inches of snow in the New York area during the past 24 hours is touching off rather heavy rain squall activity and rough seas in that particular portion of the recovery zone. Seas are running some 10 to 15 feet high and winds 30 to 40 miles per hour. In fact, at the next recovery aboard area in the South Atlantic, the weather is not even that much better. Skies are cloudy in that area, scattered rain showers, and seas running some 4 to 7 feet. And all I can say to you at this point is, when you come back to New York, we'll have your snow shovel waiting for you, Walter.
Are we going to be able to land there later this afternoon?
Yes, both Kennedy and LaGuardia airports are reporting fairly good conditions at this time. They have approximately 1 inch of snow on the runways, but they'll have it cleared for you later today.
Thank you, Gordon. Speaking about that weather downrange, where the USS Guadalcanal helicopter landing ship is standing by to recover the astronauts after splashdown a week from Thursday. And CBS News correspondent Murray Frompson is on board the ship to report that event. Yesterday, he sent us this report on her crew's preparations.
The Guadalcanal is a primary recovery ship, and for the past several days, we've been maneuvering southwest of Bermuda. Helicopter crews, frogmen, and medical teams have been running through a series of drills, using this model to simulate the actual recovery of Apollo 9. Those drills have been quite a challenge, conducted in choppy seas with high swells and waves, brisk winds, and some rain. One frogman lost his scuba tank, a shark had to be chased away by an alert helicopter pilot, and before this model could be retrieved, it was banged against the side of the Guadalcanal by the high waves, and the frogman had to leap clear. When the flight of Apollo 9 ends, the work of the Guadalcanal will just begin. Minutes before splashdown, the helicopters will take off and try to locate the honing signal being transmitted from the spacecraft. When they do, hopefully near this ship, the frogmen will start a series of procedures they've practiced so long to perfect. They'll put an anchor on the spacecraft, then place a flotation collar around it to prevent it from capsizing, and only then look into the welfare of the astronauts. If the team leader of the divers signals a thumbs up, that means the astronauts are safe and well. If, however, he signals a crossed wrists, that means a doctor is needed immediately from the helicopter hovering just above. But everyone here optimistically predicts a flawless recovery and the safe return of the spacecraft to this deck. Because the launch of Apollo 9 was delayed, the Guadalcanal has been forced to sail back and forth in or near the recovery area. It's a good thing the space agency isn't paying by the mile, for as it turns out, in the curious logic and bookkeeping of Washington, in effect, NASA is paying rent for this ship to the U.S. Navy. Murray Frompson, CBS News, aboard the USS Guadalcanal.
And the count is T-minus 17 minutes and 50 seconds and counting. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 9 will continue in a moment. Back here at the Kennedy Space Center waiting for the launch of Apollo 9, scheduled in 16 minutes from now, and the count is proceeding. A quick review. This is a 10-day Earth orbital mission around 150 miles up, the most complex mission yet planned by the space program. This to test the Lunar module, the little landing craft that will take men from the command ship circling the moon down to the moon surface and back in the eventual moon landing mission. Now perhaps planned for July, if this mission goes well. If this mission does not go well, the entire moon landing program will have to be set back. The length of time depending upon the problems that develop on this particular mission. This is the first manned test of the lunar module, and once those big boosters you see there, the 5 F-1 engines at the base of the Saturn rocket boost that 6,600,000 pounds into orbit and to the 17,500 mile-an-hour speed it takes to balance delicately between gravity and a flight on into space. Well, they will separate, and the lunar module will be tested with man in it for the first time. It's only flown once before, unmanned, this time manned flight. And the men who will take it away from the command ship 100 miles away, and will have to bring it back because otherwise they won't make it back to Earth themselves. And on the 4th day of this mission, Rusty Schweickart will make a spacewalk, 2 hours and 15 minutes. He will leave the lunar module and as it is docked to the command ship, cross back to the command ship, climb into the hatch, and then back to the lunar module to prove, first of all, the new life support equipment he'll be wearing on his back, the life support equipment that provides oxygen and cooling water and communications equipment for the walk on the moon. And this will be the first time it will be tested by man in space. He'll also be proving out a capable emergency system that could provide for man to leave the lunar module and get back to the command ship without going through the docking tunnel between them, should that tunnel for any reason be blocked. For instance, should it be damaged in docking. The entire flight to take 9 days, 22 hours and 47 minutes, the splashdown to come a week from Thursday morning, 185 miles southwest of Bermuda. The astronauts have their own views, of course, of each of the flights in which they're assigned, and David Shoemaker in New York has talked to the astronauts, their view of this flight.
Walter, attention inevitably is focused on spacecraft commanders, McDivitt in this case, or spacewalkers like Rusty Schweickart. My own candidate, however, for critical crew member is the man on the middle couch, Dave Scott. McDivitt apparently agrees, for he's insisted that Scott perform the very first docking with the LEM so that he'll have had some practice for that just in case later, in case of an emergency when he'd have to perform it alone. Throughout rendezvous, Scott has to fly the spacecraft, track the LEM, and keep new figures in his computers in case a rescue becomes necessary. Scott also does a lot of the physical work, assembling and disassembling hatches, probes, and drogues every time his colleagues want to move back and forth between the command module and the lunar module. Finally, Scott has to be able to fly re-entry alone in the event of a major tragedy, forcing him to abandon his fellow astronauts in space. It's a lot of responsibility, but Scott is a cool customer, even by West Point standards, and Schweickart and McDivitt trust him, as they made clear in an interview.
I sure am. If I wasn't confident, we'd have Dave train more. No, I think we have a mutual confidence within the crew and the abilities of the other people, and we have the same kind of confidence in the ground in them being able to supply the spacecraft with the knowledge that they need to do the mission successfully.
Are you confident that Dave Scott can handle this by himself?
We spend a lot of time training for this, and Dave, of course, during the simulations now, we have all these failures. The LEM both spacecraft in these simulations just about fall apart at the seams, so that you're always fixing this, that, or the other thing. And as a result, when you get to the flight, it's such a pleasure because you're flying around and everything isn't going wrong, you know. And of course, that's why we simulate that way, because we're always ready to handle any of these emergencies which come up and still safely return to the command module and in the end, safely return to Earth.
Scott, who holds this critical role of command module pilot, is 36 years old, He was born in San Antonio, Texas. Both his father and his father-in-law are retired Air Force generals. He himself was 5th in a class of 633 at West Point, and then went on to get a master's degree at MIT. He flew on the Gemini 8 mission back in March of 1966, and if you'll remember, that was the mission he was supposed to make a spacewalk on, but instead a thruster got stuck. It went into an uncontrolled tumbling, and the men had to make corrections and get themselves back safely to Earth. They did, and got right back to the impact point that they themselves had calculated and predicted out in the Pacific for the first safe return after a serious emergency in space. He has 2 children, Tracy and 7 and Douglas 5. The other men on this crew, might give you a quick personal rundown. Jim McDivitt, 39 years old, also an Air Force colonel. He was a pilot in the Korean War and test pilot, as all these fellows have been before becoming an astronaut. He went to the University of Michigan and was first in his class there. All of these fellows are extraordinary brains. And he flew on a Gemini 4 mission. He was the pilot when Ed White made his spacewalk, the first American spacewalk. He has 4 children, Michael 11, Ann 10, Patrick 8, and Kathleen 2. His parents live in Jackson, Michigan. He was born in Chicago. And the lunar module pilot, Russell Schweickart, is 33 years old. He was in the Air National Guard and served active duty with the Air Force, but he's now a civilian. He got both his bachelor's and master's of science degrees at MIT, and with a distinguished record there. This is his first space flight. And he has 5 children, Vicki 9, twins Randolph and Russell 8, Ellen 7, Diana 4. Born in Neptune, New Jersey. His folks live in Schweickart, New Jersey. Incidentally, all of the wives and children of the astronauts are in Houston, Texas, watching this flight by television, and their special public amplifier lash-up that they've got with the Space Center at Houston. We frequently talked about the dangers of space flight, and now with just 9 minutes to go to this one, we've been reminded of them more than one occasion on this flight. The astronauts, of course, more aware than we are. And earlier this month, David Shoemaker asked Apollo 9's commander, Jim McDivitt, how he assesses the risk of this flight.
Well, a lot of people have asked me about what I think of the risk on the mission. Everything one does is risky. Now, the chances of success are, between different things, are different. I think my chances of success of walking down the hall are pretty good. I think my chances of success of driving home are a little bit less than that, but pretty good. I think my chances of flying from here to the Cape or the Cape someplace else are pretty good. And I think my chances of flying this mission successfully are pretty good. Now, everything is relatively a little more risky or dangerous or has a little less chance of success than the previous one. Obviously, there's not a 100% chance of this mission being successful, and we all know that. Now, what that chance is, I don't know. I'm prepared to fly the mission. I think that it will be successful. If I knew of any one reason that it wouldn't be, we'd go fix it, as I mentioned earlier. I think that we're all mentally and morally prepared to accept the challenge and go off and do it.
CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 9 will continue in a moment.